Hello, welcome. We're going to This is Mr. K, American History, and we're going to talk about the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War lasted from 1754 up until 1763. In Europe, it was referred to as the Seven Years' War. Kind of interesting that the Seven Years' War lasted 9 years. Okay, but we're going to talk about the Seven Years' War and how it affected those in North America at the time. In 1754, in North America, there were two major European powers that were vying for economic control and the conquest of empire, of expanding their empires. One of them was the French. The French, they controlled what was called New France, which was lands west of the Mississippi River, and Canada. Um, also, their enemies seem to be perennially the British. They controlled the lands along the eastern seaboard, which would become the American colonies from New England all the way down to the south, just of Georgia. Um, in the 1750s, both traders from both nations were trying to gain control of a fur trade that had been flourishing for hundreds of years. Uh, Traders from England, from Britain, and from France were involved in dealing with American Indians and obtaining furs, beaver being the most plentiful and the most cherished of those furs. So eventually, they would have a showdown in what is known as the Ohio Valley. The Ohio Valley, there's a confluence of rivers there, so it's good for transportation and trade. Plus, that's where the pelts were, and Indians would come with the beaver pelts and trade with European traders to get those furs back to Europe. It was a very lucrative trade, and both wanted to control it, both France and England. So, um, Britain and France being enemies for the longest time, eventually would once again get to fighting a war. Also, never mind just the British and the French, but there also was another group of people who are involved, and that's the American Indians. They end up trading with the British and the French. Different tribes side with different countries throughout the war. It turns out that the Iroquois, they would side with the British as they were trading with the British for the longest time. One of the most powerful tribes in the Iroquois Nation were the Mohawk, led by Joseph Brant, who we will see comes up again in the American Revolution. The French had a trading history with the Algonquin tribes and with the Hurons. One thing to point out, though, is that the American Indians would kind of switch sides throughout the war. Whoever had the upper hand seemed to be who the Indians would side with. The Indians thinking that in the long run, whoever's going to win this war is who we're going to have to deal with in our land and with our situation. So they would in no way wanted to be linked up with the loser of this war. What the French and Indian War also does is it kind of sets the career going for someone who will be very important in American history, the father of our country, George Washington. It's then in the French and Indian War that he gets his first taste of military action and leadership opportunities. The young Major George Washington is sent from his colony, Virginia, to the Ohio Valley to secure Virginia trade interests in the Ohio Valley. He's only 22 years old when he's sent with a group of 150 men to go and speak to the French about departing from Fort Duquesne, which is a outpost that the French had built at that confluence of rivers, where present-day Pittsburgh is. So he's sent out there. He has some problems militarily. They skirmish with the French, and there's an ambush, and many of his men are killed, and it kind of drags his tail back to Virginia. You would think he would be embarrassed by what had happened, but it turns out that Washington kind of becomes like a cult hero. Everyone wants to talk about him, and word spreads quickly through newspapers and through word of mouth throughout the colonies about this escapade that happens in the Ohio Valley with Washington. and he kind of becomes an American hero, our first American hero, fighting the French, who have always been enemies with the British, and fighting with the Indians. During this time, the colonies feel that they need to brace for the French, and they need to combine forces in a way. So Benjamin Franklin, remember him? We'll hear about him later on too during the American Revolution and the forming of this country. Franklin organizes a meeting of representatives from all of the British colonies and some Indian tribes, and they meet in Albany, New York, and it's called the Albany Plan of Union. Um, these representatives meet. Franklin makes a suggestion that the colonists should meet together regularly, sending representatives, and that they would have the power to tax and to combine military forces. And it sounds like a precursor to the idea of a federal government. Representatives in Albany think it's a fantastic idea to unify those forces in the fight against the French and their Indian allies. So when the representatives break the meeting and go back to their assemblies, they present this idea to their own colonial assemblies. Of course, the colonial assemblies want nothing to do with anything of the sort. There's no chance that they want to give up any of their power. So that idea falls to the wayside. But cheers to you, Benjamin Franklin, for coming up with that idea. And we'll see that comes up later on. And we'll see if there's a link between the Albany Plan of Union and the start of a federal government in our nation when our nation is born. Early on in the war, the British seemed to have some trouble. The French seemed to have the upper hand when there were military skirmishes between two forces. However, both sides did have and show some strengths. The French, their strength at the time was that they were governed and led by a unified force. They were a French army. They were not an army made up of different colonial groups, much like the British were. So it was one French army led by one French king. Also, they had better relationships with their Indian allies. The Indians were more friendly with the French. It seemed that the French treated the Indians better than the British did in trade and just in regular being. So they were more susceptible to help them out and do whatever they could to help out the French. I think the Indians would have preferred if the French would have won the war. It might have been better off for the Indians, but we'll talk about that at the end. British strengths, their British settlements were a lot closer together. So there were more cities that were closer to one another, so they'd be able to help each other out. Also, there were more British subjects in North America than there were French citizens, um, and a substantially amount more. That's because when the British were coming to North America to settle, they were going to start settlements and farms where the French really weren't about sticking around. They were more about obtaining furs and continuing trade. So it was more about traders and trappers on the French side as compared to farmers and settlers that were coming from Britain. In 1755, early on in the year, there's a battle at Fort Duquesne. That's which I said was the French settlement that Washington tried to overrun on his first trip into the Ohio Valley. In this huge battle, the British general in charge of the forces, General Bulldog Braddock, is killed in the battle. As he lays dying, he takes command of the British forces and hands it to to George Washington. George Washington is now the leader of the British forces in the Ohio Valley, and that's kind of what the people back in Virginia want. They want Washington in charge, even though he's not the competent British general that Bulldog Braddock was. He's this new young leader, but he takes on this responsibility. Um, the British then have some victories in Canada, and the British capture Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne is then renamed Fort Pitt, named after the British Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt, and Fort Pitt would then become the city of Pittsburgh. The war progresses, and now we see the fall of New France and France's expulsion from the New World, from North America. In 1759, the British have several victories. They take forts at Niagara, Crown Point, and also Fort Ticonderoga. I've been to Fort Ticonderoga to visit, and it's a fantastic historic site to visit. There are reenactors there, the fort is built there, and you can really get an idea of what it was like to live in a settlement like this during the French and Indian War, during the American Revolution. So I would recommend to all students that if you have an opportunity to go and visit a place like Fort Ticonderoga. You also have a fort up in the Lake George area called Fort William Henry, which is also a fine historic site to visit. And you can ask me about that when we meet in class, and I'd love to tell you about it and maybe help to arrange a trip for you, for students. So after the British victories along the Hudson and Champlain valleys, which is in New York State, the British set their sights on Quebec. So now the battle is moving up into Canada, further to the, I guess, the central part of New France. The Battle of Quebec. Now, Quebec City is sitting on a high cliff above the St. Lawrence River. So it's very well fortified and protected naturally. So it's going to be a tough one for the British to capture. What the British do in the middle of the night, British forces cross the St. Lawrence River and then ascend the 350-foot cliffs leading up to the city of Quebec. During this battle, after the French discover the British have arrived in Quebec, they come out and meet their enemy, and the battle is fierce. During the battle, both generals, the English General Wolfe and the French General Montcalm, are killed. So you can see that you can imagine how not just the everyday soldier was dying in these battles, but also major generals who were in charge of their forces were being killed in these battles. It was really fierce fighting. According to legend, General Wolfe had his dying words as he heard that the British had won the city. General Wolfe lay dying, and he turned to then George Washington, and he said to him, "Now God be praised, I will die in peace." So you can see that General Wolfe says, "Okay, now I can die knowing well that my accomplishments have been reached, that the British have captured Quebec, and that the British are going to win this war in North America." So finally, in 1760, the British turned towards another major French city in Canada, Montreal, and they capture Montreal, thus ending the fighting in North America. The British had conquered North America and defeated the French. It would not be until 1763 when the Treaty of Paris is negotiated, and the terms of the Treaty of Paris are very interesting to see how it lays out the property lines of North America. The British, what do they gain by beating the French in this war? Well, the British, they gained the French lands that were east of the Mississippi, so you would say the Atlantic provinces of Canada today, and all of Canada. So now the British control Canada, and the British control the colonies, as we'll refer to them, which will become the American colonies. The French, and they are allowed to keep two islands in the Caribbean, which are sugar producing islands. So at least they're able to still compete monetarily and economically. So they have two sugar islands down in the Caribbean. The Spanish, who sided with the French late in the war, also are part of this treaty, and they end up ceding Florida, which they did control. Spanish Florida now goes to Britain, and the Spanish, which had property in the New World, they had control of Mexico and western part of what is today the United States. They gained New Orleans and the French lands that were west of the Mississippi. Um, so when we think about this war and why is it so important? Why do students need to study this war? Well, there are several reasons. After the war, we see that Americans now have an idea that they can stand on their own because these colonists fought against the French nation. They fought and they succeeded. They won by giving them that confidence that they were able to defeat this European power. later on that will carry on and say, you know what, we have the ability to defeat another major European power, and that will be Britain. And they decide to move towards independence from Great Britain. Also, it did create the father of our country. He was yet a young man, only 22 years old, during the French and Indian War. However, he assumed this great responsibility. Word about his heroics spread throughout the colonies. So when it comes time for the American Revolution to begin, Americans know who George Washington is, and they believe in him. And thus, he becomes this trusted leader who leads our armies into victory against the British, finally defeating Cornwallis at Yorktown, which we will talk about, and then later becoming our nation's first president. So, watch this video. Think about some questions that you might have about the French and Indian War, about some of the people involved, and when we get to class tomorrow, we'll have some activities that go along with this lesson. Thank you.